today we're discussing your new book, Reportage. This is a book that has a collection of 20 essays talking about the New World Order, geopolitics, philosophy, a bunch of different topics. And before you even get into these essays, you talked about Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2006. And the Person of the Year was you, the collective public of everyday internet users. Why did Time Magazine honor you? Well, they honored you because millions of people were creating and sharing content online through YouTube, MySpace, Wikipedia blogs, and other user-generated content. And they basically, Time Magazine argued that ordinary individuals had gained unlimited power to shape culture, media, and global conversation, and that these platforms shifted cultural power away from the elites and onto everyday people. But then by 2016, the Oxford Dictionary had the word of the year was post-truth. In 2017, Collins Dictionary had word of the year as fake news. And in 2018, dictionary.com had word of the year as misinformation. And you started your Corbett report in 2007. So basically a year after this Person of the Year. You've also been scrubbed off the internet. You've kind of had like the full experience of being online. So I guess tell us why you started your book talking about why you're the Person of the Year, and then how all of a sudden now we get to post-truth, fake news, misinformation as word of the year.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's a good question, because I think that really encapsulates in some ways, what this book is about. This book is a documentation of the journey of myself, a nobody, just an English teacher in Japan, who, through the information that I acquired online, was then able to use an online platform to ultimately spread that information to millions of people, which is truly, truly, obviously, something that would never have happened in any other era of human history. So we are in a very exciting period of history, and I hope people understand that and can recognize it for what it is. And I recognize it specifically because of that journey that I've been on, and the fact that that this has happened to me. So I know this has utterly transformed my life and the direction of where I was going. Because back in at the beginning of 2006, starting a podcast, running a website was the furthest thing from my mind. But by the end of 2006, I was starting to think, I think I have to start doing something. And what changed? Well, precisely that thing, which was being lauded in the Time Person of the Year 2006 edition, which I still remember to this day. I remember the glossy mirror cover image, so you could look at yourself in the mirror. I'm Person of the Year. Yay. But the real capper on that story is that the person who was the managing editor of Time at the time that they did that, Richard Stengel, fast forward to the 2020s, what is he doing now? Oh, he recently authored Information Wars, How We Lost the Battle Against Disinformation and What to Do About It. So the very person who was writing all of this laudatory prose about the, people are concerned about amateur hour, but I think this is what makes, American democracy great, is that everyone has their voice and has their say, and we'll get to see what the masses really think. And then fast forward a couple decades, no, we don't want the masses speaking anymore. That pretty much encapsulates the revolution that we're living through. And that's really where this book comes from, because as I say, I acquired all this information online, and I was able to disseminate it online. And I think that's exactly what the powers that shouldn't be are afraid of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was doing a little research into that timepiece, and let's not forget that 2006 is 1 year before the iPhone came out. The iPhone came out June 29th, 2007. And the person that wrote this article, he then wrote an article. They have, Time Magazine's invention of the year, and the iPhone for 2007 was the invention of the year. And when Time wrote this article, you had to go to your desktop to share all this stuff when you this is before the app and all this. How do you think, to me, I always think the cell phone really was the instigator behind all these platforms blowing up. Now, you could just be on the street filming someone, right? You don't have to actually be at your desktop.
That was certainly contributory to the explosion that we've seen. Obviously, it was more text-based a couple of decades ago and audio-based, and then video started to become a thing. And I was really, really just getting online. As I explained in the book, I had internet when I was living with my parents, but then I moved to Ireland and then I'd moved to Japan. So I hadn't had internet in my home for a number of years. And I remember at about the time that I first started getting back online seriously. I mean, obviously, I checked email at an internet cafe and what have you, but the first time I got internet back in my home, I remember talking to one of my friends here about YouTube, and he was telling me about this platform, and oh, it's kind of cool. You should check it out. And then I saw the Time Person of the Year thing, so I knew this was a phenomenon that was happening at that time, but it was still relatively new, and at that time, it was more text based and audio based. Now, fast forward a couple decades, and precisely because of that revolution where we went from walking around with a camera was a relatively rare thing. I mean, think back in 2001, there were some people on the streets of New York in 9/11 who had cameras with them, but not many. But now, if that happened today, there would be a million different, angles of every single thing that happened on 9/11. So I think that's one of the reasons that false flag terrorism would look different today than it did a couple of decades ago. But, it's interesting because there's a couple of things to note. One is that for example, I've done the Media Matrix documentary, and I've done a 5.5 hour online course on the history of mass media. And one of the people I cite in that is Marshall McLuhan, the famed Canadian media studies professor, who talked about the medium as the message. And part of the idea there is that it's not even what you say that matters as much as the medium through which you are saying it, which will shape that message in ways that you may not intend as the author, but the audience is receiving. And I definitely am keenly aware of that with regard to the work that I do, because in fact, I was just reflecting on this earlier today. I was thinking about the change that I have seen in the podcast space, for example, over the past couple of decades. I still consider the Corbett Report to be primarily, first and foremost, a podcast. And oh yeah, I do video as well, and I have articles and things. But first and foremost, what I started with was an audio podcast. And in that audio podcast medium, you would have the luxury of spending half an hour or an hour or even more than an hour really expounding on a topic and playing, significant 10-minute long clips of various things. Here's an interview, let's listen to 10 minutes of it, that kind of thing. But now in the YouTube age or the TikTok age or whatever we're moving into, no. Everything has to be like 1-2 minutes tops, or else you're going to lose everybody's attention. Everyone's a moron these days. And I think that is a reflection of the visual video medium that we're more and more imbibing. We are entering a post-literate age. Yes, we are literate. Most of us still can read, but we don't read nearly as much as we did even a couple of decades ago. Fast forward this another couple of decades, and it's a genuine question how much we'll be reading at all.
What's been the biggest changes in the media since you started in 2007? I find it interesting because people used to refer to, like, say, network television as kind of like mainstream media. Now they refer to it as legacy media. But I find it interesting because some people would say Joe Rogan is alternative media, yet the number one rated network news show is ABC's show with Nightly News with David Muir, which has somewhere around 7 million viewers. Joe Rogan averages 11 million viewers / listeners, and his program is over 3 hours long. Yeah. So if you actually factor in the dedication to watch 3 hours, so to me that would signify that Joe Rogan is actually mainstream and the rest of the networks are actually the alternative media. And then of course we can't forget about the adpocalypse in 2017 that YouTube had, where you essentially had a bunch of corporations pull advertising due to some of the content that they didn't find to be conducive to selling ads. And then that kind of changed the algorithm. And you talk a lot about the algorithm in the book and on your podcast. So what would be the biggest changes that the media has undertaken from 2007 when you started to 2022 6 almost now.
Well, again, I think that the biggest change is reflected in exactly what we were talking about earlier with, for example, Richard Stengel going from, yay, great, a lot of people are going to come and start bringing their voices, going into, oh, no, we don't want people in their voices. We got to start censoring. That is the change in a nutshell. And it's because I remember when I was, again, even before I started the Corbett Report, when I was just getting into this online information space, of course, what was the thing that we heard all the time? Where did you hear that? On the internet? Ha ha ha. As if it was just, I mean, self-evidently untrue. If you heard something on the internet, it was true if you heard it on CNN or read it in the New York Times. But yes, now in 2025, it's almost the exact opposite. And perhaps the best reflection of that was a guest that Stephen Colbert was interviewing a year or two ago. And I don't remember the specifics of this, but I remember it was a CNN reporter that he was talking to, and Colbert made some sort of comment about, well, you know, CNN, people know to trust CNN or something like that. And his audience started laughing, and he said, no, that wasn't a joke. Like, he genuinely thought he was making a real statement there. But no, nobody takes CNN and those mainstream or legacy outlets seriously anymore. And I think that is the mindset shift that has occurred over the past couple of decades. So now, as you say, Joe Rogan is blowing out of the water the top rated legacy media, news broadcasts. That is significant. And one of the significant things about that is that, for example, a Rogan has brought back the long form content, the 3-hour big, long, rambling conversations that I think are more reflective of what people were used to. I mean, for example, it's been pointed out, I believe Neil Postman points this out in his Amusing Ourselves to Death. Presidential debates back 100, 200 years ago would be people standing on stage for all day, essentially, having hour-long opening remarks, and then an hour-long opening remark of the other presidential candidate, and then they'd go back and forth for another couple of hours, and then there'd be a break, and then they'd have another 4 hours of debate. And now, what is it? It's 10-second news bites that you might see a clip of on the evening news. That seems to have been the sort of the logical course that this mass media has taken us into the shorter and shorter attention span. And now we've gotten down to the Vine era of 6-second clips and TikTok of, maybe 1 minute, etc. So there is that direction of this media. But then there are things that are more hopeful, like, say, Rogan bringing back the 3-hour conversation, etc. And it does reflect, at the very least, people can choose to invest their time in different ways depending on their availability at the moment. And yes, maybe, riding a bus, they've got 2 minutes between stops. They're going to check, their Twitter feed for 60 seconds. Or maybe they're on an hour-long drive and they need something to occupy them. But the point is, now with the technology being so widely dispersed and available and literally in everybody's hand, they can choose what they want at the moment that they want it. So you could make an argument that it's not all apocalyptic, the direction in which we're heading. But I think it is what we make it. And I've been very conscious of that from the beginning of my work at the Corbett Report, is that this is, in some ways, a sort of a new medium. I mean, it's really just combining a bunch of media that already existed, audio and visual format and presentation, but the way that it's being distributed is different, and the way people are taking it in is different with these handheld devices that they're walking around with everywhere. So we can make it into what we want, and we can have big, long, in-depth discussions like this one. And yeah, it's probably not going to have millions and millions and millions of people listening to it eagerly, but the people who do listen to it are going to be very invested in conversations like this and actually willing to listen. And again, I think that's a type of communication, at least on this scale, that has never existed before in human history.
I've been reading this book called Post-Journalism by Andre Meir. And he basically says in this book that in 2014 was the first year where the media, basically the subscriber or reader, this is the first year where the subscriptions made more money than the ad revenue. And it wasn't because the subscription revenue exploded. It was because the ad revenue cratered. So then he basically says, like, you have say the New York Times, where you have to create these different revenue sources. And so now you have like the foundation model, which is just a polite way to say essentially activist, right? Like, you have these foundations that want to support a cause. You write a bunch of articles because you lost your main funding source, which is the advertisers, because they all went to Google, went to Facebook, they went to the internet, right? And so he, kind of his thesis is that that's why he calls it post journalism, but we're in this kind of like limbo period where the traditional quote unquote mainstream media is not making money. But then at the same time, a lot of the small content creators aren't making a whole lot of money, because if you have content that the algorithm doesn't like, you also get demonetized. Well, you might essentially be in a situation where they share your content, but they demonetize your content. So it's kind of like, well, you get views, but you don't make any money. I'm not sure which is worse. But anyways, how do you foresee the next 5 years? Because it seems like we are in this limbo period where the mainstream media is not making money. I mean, the fact is, like you just mentioned, Stephen Colbert, where his show didn't get renewed. Well, it's like, well, why would your show get renewed if you're losing $80 million a year or whatever? Of course you're not getting renewed. So if legacy media is losing money, a lot of the alternative media is not making money. What's the business model? Like, how is it going to change in the next 5-10 years?
It's a more important question than it even seems at first glance, because of course this isn't just about business or making money. This is really the question of, can people make a living doing journalism at this point? And if so, how? And that obviously will reflect what type of information is disseminated in society and how it is disseminated. And I don't know to what extent this was that I consciously thought about this from the inception of the Corbett Report, but I always knew I didn't want to do an advertising model. That was not the way that I wanted to sponsor my work. And in fact, when I started the work, I know people will find this incredulous at this point, but it was truly, genuinely the furthest thing from my mind that I would ever, at any point, be able to make money from it. I was just putting it up because this is incredibly important information, and I want it to get out there. And eventually, after 4 years of doing it as sort of a full-time job on top of my actual full-time job of teaching, I finally got to the point where, with a subscriber base, where I thought, well, okay, I think I can actually do this full-time now, so I'm going to do it. But that impulse of mine to keep truly independent journalism separate from advertising revenue has been a saving grace, because you mentioned the adpocalypse of 2017, and I know that devastated certain independent media outlets that were around at that time and were thriving until they suddenly got demonetized, and suddenly their entire business model had cratered and they weren't able to support themselves. Luckily, I was not affected by that at all, because I did have to monetize my YouTube channel at some point in order to access longer than 10-minute uploads and choose your own thumbnail or whatever. They had all these restrictions back in the day, so I had to monetize the channel. And in order to do that, I had to monetize at least one video. So I took one video from way back in the archives that no one had seen in 10 years or whatever. And let's monetize that one. And I don't think I ever earned a single cent from it, but that was the extent of my YouTube monetization. So when my channel was demonetized at a certain point, but I didn't even notice because I wasn't monetizing my videos, and that wasn't the way I was making my money. So I think there is something to the idea that rather than relying on the old advertising model, I think people moving forward should at least be thinking about building up a subscriber base. And it doesn't have to be a huge subscriber base spending tons of money, but it has to be people who are actually connected to the work. And one would think that would at least be more conducive to a meritorious system where people who are doing good work will be supported by people who want to see more of that work. Now, of course, that might mean just lowest common denominator stuff. Whoever has the clickbaitiest, flashiest headlines and what have you will rise to the top of that dog heap, maybe. But I'd like to think that in the end, quality wins out. So that would be my aspiration for where we're going. More of a reader or listener supported work model than an advertising supported model. Having said that, is that where we are actually going? In fact, I mean, if we really want to start talking 5 or 10 years out, we have to, I think, start talking about the AI slop, which is already infesting every platform and undoubtedly will be overwhelming most platforms in the near future. So perhaps, again, aspirationally, moving forward from here, the selling point could be, hey, I'm a real human being. And, I don't know how you're going to prove that online very soon, because it'll be basically unprovable at a certain point. But hey, I'm a real human being, and, I'm giving you my actual human take on this, might actually be a way of selling, at least to people who still care about that sort of thing.
Yeah, I almost wonder you're talking about like the dead internet theory, where essentially everything is generated by AI. So then I almost wondered, do you then go back to like newspapers? I
Yeah.
can't imagine that being the case, but
Well,
it's
it's
like,
funny you should mention that
yeah,
because Whitney Webb is currently starting a magazine, which I believe will be out sometime in the new year, as part of that response. The digital space is becoming polluted. And also, of course, with digital ID and digital censorship and other such things coming on the horizon, we do need to have physical media that we physically have in our hands that can't just be turned off at a flip of a switch. So I think there is a genuine growing movement towards something more paper-based at the moment. And that's at least one of the reasons I decided to put some of this research into physical book form, because, they can scrub me off YouTube with a flick of a switch, as they did for 4 years, but they can't take a book out of existence at a flip of a switch.
since you mentioned Whitney Webb, I feel like I have to mention that she did forward your book, Reportage. I feel like I'd have to throw that in there. So I'm not sure if you've seen this viral clip that went around with Joe Rogan recently. I think this was like a few days ago. But basically, Joe Rogan says,
if you're clinging on to this left versus right, these culture war arguments, you are getting caught up in their bullshit game. Most people want the same thing. They want to be healthy. They want their family to be healthy and happy. They want to have a pursuit that they enjoy. They want to enjoy their community, enjoy their loved ones. That's what most people want. Most people want the same thing.
Yep.
Most of the shit that you're seeing has all been stirred up by foreign governments and special interest groups and a bunch of shit. And if you're online, they're spoon feeding it to you.
and of course, when you say something like that, naturally, the internet will destroy you. Right. So basically, Joe Rogan got criticized for this. He was allegedly promoting both sidesism and the idea that both the Democratic and Republican parties are fundamentally similar, controlled by corporate interest. Apparently, that's not correct. However, you have a whole chapter on your book, Up Down Politics, which would probably more agree with Joe Rogan. So I'll let you just put in your own words what you would say to this.
Yes. Okay. So the left-right paradigm that we have been presented is supposedly a totalizing explanation for our political reality. There is a left, there is a center, there is a right. It's a spectrum, so there are varying degrees along there. You can have far right and far left. You can have moderate right and left. You can have center, etc. But that's the limits of our thinking, at least as we're presented in the establishment level discourse about politics. And I think, to be clear, I don't think that that's completely unfair. I think there is a left and right degree to, or a left and right spectrum to politics. But I think there is also an up and down dimension. And that is what I talk about in the Up Down Politics essay. And the up and down dimension is essentially authoritarianism versus anti-authoritarianism. And because that axis of at the very least, the two-dimensional political universe that we live in, because that axis has been so completely occluded from our attention, we tend to think, we don't think about that at all, and thus can be misled by authoritarians on the left and authoritarians on the right to think that, well, that's what else can exist. There's left and right and center. So whatever, we have to go with this. And we can be led in the authoritarian direction through decade after decade, generation after generation, until we end up in a space where most people do not want to be, but all those people individually felt they were acting in the right way at the right times. So, I mean, one obvious example, after the Bush administration, the Bush Jr. administration became extremely unpopular after the War of Terror and all of the global financial crisis and all of that. What did the people do? They wanted hope. They wanted change. So along came someone whose literal campaign slogan was hope and change. And so they voted for it basically on the premise that, well, at least this is the opposite of what we had before. And of course, as we know, well, it turned out remarkably similar in a lot of ways. We had the too big to jail phenomenon. We had the expansion of the War of Terror into new countries, etc., evisceration of constitutional rights, quote unquote, et cetera, et cetera. So, hey, wait, this isn't what we voted for. So what did people vote for in 2016? Well, hey, we need a different direction. So they go for a different direction. And they end up getting someone who talked about draining the swamp. Yay, let's drain the swamp. And then ends up populating his administration with Goldman Sachs insiders and CIA swamp dwellers and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and people like that. Wait, no, this isn't what we voted. Carry that process forward and repeat it in every country around the world, essentially, that's at least harboring fantasies about some sort of liberal democracy. And that has played out for the course of decades, generations, and has completely obscured what is really happening here, which is that there is a corporate, financial, economic elite or elitist class that is clearly having more of a say over the various nations' politics than these political puppets are. You can change the puppet out every few years and change the birdcage liner, but it's going to be the same thing in the end. And why is this? What's happening? It is, again, it's because there is this uppest dimension to politics. So that's what I try to talk about in that Up-Down Politics essay. And one thing that I point to, I think concretely along those lines, is in the event of the global financial crisis, we saw two movements arise in response to the craziness that was happening, the hundreds of billions of dollars that were suddenly being pumped into Wall Street and taken out of Main Street. And the response was the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. And again, we can put that in the left-right spectrum. Well, okay, so you had Occupy on the left, you had Tea Party on the right? But the core essential impetus of both those movements and what they were about and what they were arguing for were very similar in a lot of respects, essentially identifying that it's the 99% versus the 1%. There's a small oligarchical elite class that is really puppeteering these things. It's financial in nature. It's not to do with the left-right politics party game. Both of those movements, of course, became corrupted and co-opted by the Democrats and the Republicans and the establishment parties. But I think at base, a lot of these people had the same fundamental concerns, but they were driven apart by the culture war issues. So that is my quick read on the politics of the 21st century in America, in the American context at the very least, is that you essentially had a moment of sort of mass realization. You had arenas full of tens of thousands of people chanting, "End the Fed, end the Fed, end the Fed." You had people identifying that there was some sort of financial shenanigans going on and that was beyond left-right politics. And then you got it co-opted into a culture war fight. And since then, the only thing people want to talk about is transgender bathrooms or what have you. And suddenly, who the hell cares? Goldman Sachs and places like that, whatever. I don't know. That sounds highfalutin. I want to talk about my neighbor who wears the wrong color dress or whatever it is. So I think that is the way that I would frame what's happening. And it's, again, are we to trust the response that Rogan gets online to comments like that, given that, as we've just discussed, the dead internet theory, we know at the very least that every single nation, essentially, that has the capability to do so is deploying PSYOPs, online PSYOPs officers, warriors from their military online in order to create fake social media accounts. We've known about that for at least 2 decades at this point, and I've documented that on my podcast before. So are we to really care so much what we perceive to be the online reaction to these things, or can we at least hold skepticism that, maybe some of that reaction to very sensible statements like what Rogan is making there, maybe some of that reaction is actually synthetic?
In your book, you talk about the Bilderberg Group, World Economic Forum, or WEF. I've read a lot of books recently on elite theory, and I think they would kind of fit into that. And of course, those are just a couple of the most obvious ones. I mean, there's a bunch of these elite global conferences. You have the Council on Foreign Relations, which you also mentioned in the book, but you have like the Trilateral Commission, Sun Valley Conference, the Munich Security Conference, the Clinton Global Initiative,
the World Government Summit.
Right. Yeah, there's so many. So I guess the question would be, how would elite theory and what are these conferences like 20 years ago? If you said Bilderberg Group, first thing people would say is you're a conspiracy theorist. And then I was actually researching this for this podcast, and there's academic research on it going back a few years. And they're like, well, it used to be the domain of a conspiracy theorist, but there is actually a lot of there's actual things that happen at these conferences. So it seems like it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. So what would you talk about, if someone asked you about the WEF or Bilderberg or one of these?
Perhaps the most effective way to introduce these types of things to people is to ask people in advance what they would think about certain things. And one example that comes to my mind is, hey, what if you were to find out that really the upper echelon of American business and finance and politics met in the Redwoods every summer for a 2-week encampment in which they're doing mock human sacrifices under a large owl statue? Like, what would you think about that? Does that sound crazy? Like people wearing hoods, and there's this elaborate play with the voice of, was it Dan Rather for a number of years? Not Dan Rather. Walter Cronkite, I should say, is the voice of this owl as, they cremate care every summer in the Redwoods and do whatever they're doing out there. What would you think about that? Oh, that's crazy. That's absolute total nonsense. Oh, no, actually, it's completely openly admitted. It's the Bohemian Grove, and they do this every year. And here's video footage of it. Here's the mainstream press coverage that's been going on. I mean, they were even talking about it in the 80s and 90s. It was covered in establishment media, etc. But I think it's that sort of cognitive dissonance between that's so crazy, I can't believe that exists, to yes, of course that exists, and you know what, it's not a big deal after all. They're just whatever. It's guys going around having fun for a couple of weeks. It doesn't mean anything. And I think if you can get people to at least recognize the mental pretzel knots that they have to tie themselves into when they encounter information like that, they might start to recognize what's really going on here, which is essentially, as you say, they might write academic papers about Bilderberg now, whereas a couple of decades ago, you would literally be called a conspiracy theorist for saying that Bilderberg existed, which is kind of crazy because it's documentably existed since 1954. But again, it's that sort of that mental inversion that has to do. And when it is mainstreamized, when it becomes that mainstream sort of accepted thing, then it is sanitized. I think the way that this works is that's crazy. It doesn't exist. You're crazy for even thinking about it. Oh my God, you're an idiot. You're a Fruit Loop. You're a tinfoil hat nut. To yes, of course it exists, and it means nothing, and you're crazy for caring that it exists. And if you can just get people to see that, I think there might be some cognitive dissonance that they might be able to work past in order to understand the phenomenon.
Kind of talking about how we can't talk about this left-right where maybe 5 years ago you said this, and then 5 years ago you'll say the opposite, and it goes from left to right. And I think the biggest example right now is immigration. To think like 30 years ago, the Democrats were wanting closed borders. Bill Clinton was shipping all these immigrants out of the country. And what was the reason? Well, it's just simple economics. The more workers that you have will suppress the wages. And also, where were most of the immigrants in? They were in Texas, which was a state that was Republican. And we all know that the number of representatives per district is based on the population, not based on the citizens. So all these Democrats were complaining about how Texas had an unfair advantage because they had all this extra population from the immigrants that came over. And now it's completely flipped. And so you're like this horrible person if you are anti-immigrant, whatever. It's like, but I thought like not too long, and even Obama was also part of cracking down on this. And then it was the same thing during the start of the pandemic. If Trump would have created the vaccine, if he was still in office, you mentioned Stephen Colbert. I mean, they were making fun of Big Pharma. He had a whole podcast or a whole episode ripping on Big Pharma because Trump was going to be in bed with Big Pharma. But then he was out of office the time they got the vaccine. Then the Democrats had it. So it's like, well, we're just going to flip our opinion based on who's in office on these things. I mean, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but it seems some of this stuff is pretty obvious,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how many issues could we do that with? Same-sex marriage. Obama, Clinton, every mainstream Democrat was against it right up until the 2010s, and suddenly you can't even think of questioning such a thing. The Iraq War. You had Biden and all these other mainstream Democrats voting for the Iraq War, but now, of course, now they've completely flipped on it, as you should. obviously the COVID era stuff, and all of that flip. And of course, all of these free speech, First Amendment warriors on the right side of the right-left spectrum who were 100%, facts don't care about your feelings and screw you, we can say what we want, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's like, yeah, kick those people, kick those damn college students out of the country for protesting and being on the wrong side of the Israel-Palestine conflict, etc. So, yeah, the hypocrisy abounds. And again, unless you can get people to see that hypocrisy, I'm not sure how effective it will be in getting people's minds around the greater psyop that's going on. I mean, it's not actually difficult to understand. It is team sport politics. People have invested their identity in a certain team, and they're going to root for that team no matter what. Whatever's happening, whatever the line is today, they will support that line because they want their team to win. That's all it is.
I saw you on the Jimmy Dore show recently where you're talking about AI, Bill Gates, and electricity, which of course goes into climate change environmentalism. But we all know that Bill Gates has been a huge supporter of all these quote unquote climate change initiatives. He wrote a book in 2021 called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and breakthroughs we need. He, of course, has his Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund, the BEF. He does a lot of stuff with like geoengineering, especially with solar. And he did a complete 180. And then, as you mentioned in that episode, where he basically took the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant and that's back on, let's fast track this, even though we had a meltdown in 1979, like let's not worry about it. Let's just get as much electricity as we can. So did Bill Gates actually do a 180 because he started reading the IPCC reports closely, or was it because he needs electricity? I mean, let's not forget that Microsoft is the single biggest owner of OpenAI at right around 27% ownership. So what's the reason that he did this 180?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's necessarily one and only one reason. I would assume it's not because he has actually studied the IPCC reports and found them wanting. I think it is obviously for self-serving interests, but one interest I am sure has to be the fact that suddenly energy and the production of energy is the number one concern for these Silicon Valley overlords at this point, and Bill Gates no exception, obviously. Another aspect of this that I don't think we should neglect is that I think that this is probably part of the longer term operation to transform the climate narrative, because of course we grew up for the last few decades with the carbon dioxide, global warming narrative. That was it. I mean, we're putting out too much carbon dioxide, therefore global warming, therefore we have to stop. And that was the narrative. But that narrative, it was actually widely, almost universally believed a decade or two ago. And I think a lot of people were on board with that. But no one actually, when it came time to actually, okay, so now we're going to start taxing and we're going to start cutting back and we're going to start reducing and all of this, a lot of people go, oh, wait, no, this isn't going to affect my life. Like maybe other people, maybe I'll do the token thing. I'll buy the product with the green label or whatever, but I'm not going to really sacrifice for this. And I think that reality has set in with the climate cult, essentially, that has been trying to foist that narrative on people for social manipulation concerns. And so I think they are changing tack right now. And one of the ways that they're attempting to change track is to make the climate emergency into a health emergency, both in terms of planetary health, this sort of one health concept that the WHO and the UN are working together to try to foist onto the public. The idea that we are responsible for the whole ecosystem's health, and everything, every plant, every blade of grass, every tree, every butterfly, everything is all part of one ecosystem, and its health is all dependent, but also literally making climate into a health issue for humans. And we had the first diagnosis of, I think it was heart disease because of global warming in BC, in British Columbia, a couple of years ago. And that is going to be the move going forward. So Bill Gates downplaying the climate crisis as a temperature phenomenon, which is what he did in his blog post. He was downplaying it's not necessarily that we're going to run off the cliff in terms of rising thermometer numbers, but he's still obviously concerned and pushing on the health emergency generally in terms of climate change. And I think that's going to be more of the push going forward. And obviously the Gates Foundation has been very, very invested in that narrative and will be undoubtedly more so in the future. So I think there's a number of reasons why Bill Gates is sort of changing the narrative, but he's not fundamentally changing the narrative. It's still about manipulation and still about social, getting people to conform to their neo-feudal lifestyle.
Yeah, you've talked and written a lot about the Bill Gates Foundation. I mean, of course, it was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then he got divorced a few years back, and he kind of rebranded it to just the Gates Foundation. He's had a lot of negative publicity, kind of fallout from the pandemic. Of course, we're talking about how he did the 180 on the climate stuff. Rebranded the foundation, and then of course all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. So he's kind of been getting dinged in the media, and so he decided in May of this year to change his deadline. Now he's going to give away all of his wealth in 20 years, which with the amount of money that he has, he could do a lot of damage or a lot of good depending on what he decides to do. I guess the question is, what do you think he's like? What is his goal? Is he trying to leave a legacy of positivity? Like he's actually realizing that maybe the things that he did weren't good? He even had Warren Buffett, who, years ago said that he was going to give all of his money to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then he even said that he's not giving money to him anymore. He then created his own foundation where his son's in charge of it. So did Warren Buffett sour on Bill Gates? It seems like he's going through this transition period as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing to keep in mind with regards to all of this is that this is all a gigantic PR game. That is essentially what this is. And all the PR that money can buy. And how much can you buy with however many hundreds of billions of dollars are in Bill Gates' name at this point? So to contextualize this, I did the Who is Bill Gates documentary back in 2020. And in hindsight, I mean, in 2025, people might even wonder, well, what's the big deal? Bill Gates, he's just that old fuddy-duddy. But back in 2020, as people may or may not remember, he was on every single news program as the health expert that everyone had to turn to, because, of course, the Gates Foundation was funding all of these news agencies behind the scenes. So he was definitely an important part of the entire COVID narrative / agenda. Having said that, yeah, that has changed over the past 5 years. And at least part of that is because of the divorce and the Epstein stuff and the affair that he was having with that girl, the bridge player or whatever, all that kind of shenanigans that has been unearthed since then. And we've seen Gates take a much lower profile and is not quite featured as much. Although, interestingly, of course, he did pop up at that White House banquet a couple of months ago boasting about how he and Trump like to have conversations about gene editing techniques and how that's going to be the next level of American innovation in the future. They're going to cure cancer and all of this with this wonderful gene editing and other things. So he's definitely still working on these things, just on a lower profile basis. Having said that, yeah, has he seen the light, and is he going to start devoting his life to genuine philanthropy as opposed to what he's been doing, which is essentially PR / social manipulation? I'm holding my breath on that one. Obviously, I don't see into the hearts and minds of people, so could he have had his Ebenezer Scrooge moment? I suppose it's a possibility, but I see no evidence of that, really. We'll have to see how he actually devotes this money going forward, but if the past is any indication, he's going to use it to promote his agenda in various ways. And I show that time and time and time again throughout the Bill Gates documentary that I did. For example, Gates personally starting to approach various researchers to try to find out the feasibility of, for example, implantable birth control devices that could be operated remote control at a distance. Why is he so interested in such things? Well, obviously, it's about population control, which has been one of his main driving focuses, as he has explained, and as Melinda Gates was also 100% on board with, and they talked about many times. Controlling the human population, the global population, was their number one concern, because obviously the more humans, the worse for the planet. So if whether they genuinely believe that and are genuinely doing it out of concern for the environment, or whether perhaps, as I speculate, he's just a eugenicist who believes that the world is for him and his progeny and his kind, not so much you and me and everyone else. In any event, it amounts to the same thing, this obsessive drive to try to control and limit the human population. I suspect we will see more of that going forward. But the real template for this is the Rockefeller Foundation. That was the big PR trick that was pulled by the Rockefeller family, specifically starting with John D. Rockefeller Sr., who founded the foundation and started this process of converting this massive amount, this unbelievable, mind-boggling amount of wealth that the Rockefeller family had accrued through their monopolization of the world's primary energy resource at the time, oil, obviously, and parlaying that into real political and social capital that was then wielded for specific purposes. And in my How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World documentary, I go through that particular history and the purposes to which it was put. But that was a calculated move. And you have the man who invented the modern PR industry, Ivy Lee, as the Rockefeller sort of impresario who managed that transition. And we don't have to speculate about this being the template, because Bill Gates' father, Bill Gates Sr., actually Bill Gates II, because Bill Gates is Bill Gates III. Anyway, whatever. Bill Gates Sr. Literally wrote about that in his book, Showing Up for Life, where he wrote that the Rockefeller, everywhere we went in the field of philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation were already there. And we modeled the Gates Foundation on the works that the Rockefeller had done. And, as a PR maneuver, it definitely worked, because these days, people, when they hear Rockefeller, they're more likely to think of Rockefeller Center or Rockefeller Plaza or these various monuments to the Rockefeller family or their various foundation efforts, etc., than they are to think about this, what was literally, by cartoonists of the age back in the early 20th century, pictured, Rockefeller Sr.'s head as the head of this tentacled octopus beast that was straddling the world. We don't tend to think of the Rockefellers in that way anymore, because that PR effort was incredibly successful. And in the exact same way, back in the 90s, there were a lot of people who hated Bill Gates and understood him to be a monopolist who was doing some very bad things. But now, fast forward a couple decades, and there's a lot of people who think, oh, good guy Gates, he's giving away his wealth. So as a PR maneuver, it's been remarkably successful.
Speaking of John D. Rockefeller, he started his foundation in 1913, which was the year that the U.S. instituted income tax. And he started with $100 million. And in 2025, it's worth $6 billion. And I don't know, it's just insane to think that his money and his prestige and everything has outlived him by like a century. In 2025, going into 2026, like, what does the Rockefeller Foundation actually do? Like, is it still really influential? I mean, you hear the name, like, how much impact does it actually have? Because everyone hears about Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They hear about Jeff Bezos. They hear about Mark Zuckerberg and the Chan Initiative, his wife. You have Steve Jobs' Steve Jobs' widow. After he passed away, he left his money to her, and she has Lorraine Powell? She's got a lot of money, and she does a lot of stuff. Of course, George Soros, right? Everyone knows about him, but people don't really talk too much about the Rockefeller Foundation. How much impact do they have right now?
That's a good observation, because they certainly aren't the first thing that people think about anymore. As you say, Chan Zuckerberg and Bezos and whatever, Gates, etc., are much more in front of people and in the public limelight. But the Rockefeller Foundation is definitely still around and still involved in all of these activities all over the place. When you're looking for it, you do see the Rockefeller name popping up in all of the places you would expect it to pop up. For example, during the scamdemic, Operation Lockstep came from a Rockefeller report. That idea of, sometime if there's some sort of pandemic, we're going to have to lock down, et cetera, et cetera. That was all from the Rockefeller Foundation. Or I've done a lot of work on the Africa green revolution /gene revolution, that the Gates Foundation is absolutely 100% the identifiable and very much everyone sees the Gates Foundation's tentacles in that particular pie. But it's the Rockefeller Foundation that was there first and that is continuing to be there alongside the Gates Foundation, funding the GM monstrosities and other things that they're trying to replace nature with, essentially, in Africa. That they're very much involved with that. If you really dig into the Rockefeller Foundation, they're still involved in all these activities. They're just definitely not taking the front seat in terms of, the public spotlight.
Kind of last big question before we wrap this up here, since I know you got a deadline, which is basically, of course, you kind of start the book, you talk about 9/11, you talk about the real estate financial crash 2008, of course, the pandemic, and how these crises are used to gain power, Patriot Act, of course, after 9/11, etc., the bailouts, trillions of dollars after '08. What is the next crisis, next pandemic, the next crash? What would be your kind of best guess right now?
I will make a prediction, but before I do, I should preface it by saying that probably the most likely outcome, whatever the next crisis is, will be one that no one is really expecting. Or let me rephrase that, because I like looking back at the scamdemic crisis and what occurred there. I won't say no one was expecting that. In fact, as I pointed out at the time, I had my 2009 podcast on medical martial law, and I talked about the Zika phony crisis and the pig flu, swine flu crisis, and all of these ginned up health crises. And I talked about the infrastructure for instituting lockdowns and quarantines and forced vaccinations. So I'd been talking about that for years and years and years. So when it actually happened, I can't say it was completely out of left field and totally surprising. But having said that, I didn't go into 2020 thinking, yep, this is the year there's going to be a pandemic. And it seemed to come out of left field. So I imagine whatever crisis actually is the next crisis will be similar. But having said that, I have been noting for years now the parallels in pre-World War I and pre-World War II situations. The obvious example is the Thucydides trap, which is this noted thing which, scholars argue about whether it's real or not. But anyway, the thesis is something like, when you have an established regional, or in our day and age, global hegemon that is being threatened by an upstart, more often than not, they're going to go to war. And the obvious example of that from the early 20th century, we saw the rising German power, and we saw the established British Empire, and they went to war, as predicted. So that's sort of the general framework. And if we were to put that in 21st century terms, obviously the US empire, and we see the rising Chinese force, along with obviously Russia and Iran and various people that are associated with it. But maybe I'm biased here in the Asia Pacific, but I tend to think China is going to be the 21st century boogeyman in the way that Russia was the 20th century boogeyman, the way Germany was the early 20th century boogeyman. So I see things in that way. Also, some of the parallels between the economic turmoil of the 30s and for example, turning to tariffs and sanctions as a type of tit for tat trade war that was developing prior to actual war, et cetera, et cetera. I see a lot of parallels to the times that we're living through right now. So if that is the basis of what we are living in, I do see the eventuality of a hot war being at least a potential for the next crisis. And I couldn't put a time frame on that, but I do note that so many pundits and so many scenarios and so many predictions, et cetera, have fallen on the 2027 timescale. And a lot of them talk about China and going after Taiwan, and that sort of being the beginning of something. So if I was to absolutely, you have to make a prediction, okay, 2027, China goes for Taiwan and World War III is on. Again, I think the actual crisis that will precipitate will again probably be something out of left field, but I do think the pieces are being set up for some type of hot war scenario.
What about financial crisis? I mean, you had Michael Burry, who of course shorted the housing market back in was it 2 years before the collapse? I mean, he's shorting these AI companies now. Or is that just too obvious? I mean, I had a podcast like a year ago. It's like almost 400,000 views. I was talking about the AI bubble. We were like the first people to really talk about it. But now it's like everyone's like, oh, even like Sam Altman said we're in a bubble, right? I mean, when you go, so I guess or is that just too obvious? Or do you think like there's so much money in these companies, and the Mag 7 makes up such a big what is it, like 35% of the Fortune 500 companies is made up by 7 companies. It seems like that has to be a ticking time bomb, or is it just the fact that they'll be bailed out anyways? And Or maybe they've been bailed out. Didn't they have a $500 billion, was it the Stargate thing? Maybe they've already, that was like a pre-bailout bailout, right?
That isn't supposedly money that the White House is like signing for over to companies. No, they're going to invest $500 billion in this infrastructure, and they'll have, government support, etc. So yeah, what is it all? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and undoubtedly, like so many other things, when the tide goes out, we'll see who's actually wearing their swimming trunks and who's naked. And there will probably be a lot of naked people when that tide does go out, which it will. But having said that, in the same way, the .com bubble was absolutely a bubble. And, a lot of pets.com and all sorts of nonsense, went under when that bubble burst. But that didn't mean the internet was over. It's not like, oh, yeah, that internet thing, that was a 90s thing. But then the .com bubble burst and we never heard of the internet again. No, of course. It just transformed the sort of business model that they were working on. So I think the types of transformative technologies that we're seeing that are being called AI, call them what you will, chatbots and LLMs and other such things, generative AI of various sorts, is undoubtedly a truly genuine technological change that is taking place that will have an effect on industry. But yeah, what companies survive and what kind of economic mayhem might be caused by a bubble burst is certainly a crisis that could eventuate. And the worrying part about this crisis is that the only way for AI companies to really grow into the investment bubble that they've created is essentially by making good on their promise of replacing human labor. I mean, the more you'll be able to displace actual human labor and cut costs of corporations down to minuscule, labor costs, the more that these AI companies will be worth, quote unquote, their valuation. But then where does that leave society? And of course, if we ask Elon Musk and others, well, obviously we're going to have to turn to some form of universal basic income, which I would like to think people with their heads screwed on straight understand what that means in terms of the amount of control that governments will have over their populations. Because if you're relying on Uncle Sam or whoever to literally feed and clothe you, well, then you're going to roll up your arms for whatever genetic slurry is coming down the line and whatever else the government tells you to do.
So James Corbett has been our guest today. We talked about his new book, Reportage. He's got 20 essays talking about New World Order, geopolitics, philosophy, etc. Just let us know where people can purchase your book. You also have, of course, the Corbett Report. You have a big presence online. And then just hopefully you can wrap up with a 1-minute final thought after that.
Well, if people who are interested in the book should go to reportagebook.com. That's where you can get the hardback. You can get the paperback. It's available in many online sellers. The ISBN number is there, so you can theoretically go into any actual honest-to-God brick-and-mortar bookstore in the world and hopefully order it that way. And as we're recording this, in the coming days, hopefully, or at least in the coming week or so, the audiobook will be available at reportagebook.com, read by yours truly. So people can look forward to that. I am at corbettreport.com. And basically, I'd just like to exhort your audience, if you're interested in the things that we're talking about today, I have now almost 19 years worth of archive material on all of this stuff. And that's all there for free. You can become a member of my website, and I do appreciate it, but all my material, all of the audio and video and everything is there for free. So I hope people will use it as a resource. That is what it has been intended to be since the very beginning. Hey, I found this in my research. I think it's important. Take a look at it. And that's what I generally ask people to do.
And final thought?
I would just like to say things are dark, and they're probably going to get darker before the light. But if I didn't have faith that we could change the course that we're heading on from the darkness to the light, I wouldn't be here doing it. So on that note, I also do a Solutions Watch series that I'd encourage people to check out if they're interested, where I try to concentrate on things that at least people are doing to try to make the world a better place.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.